Hello and welcome to the March 9th edition of the Cluster API provider AWS Office Hours, a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle and Cluster API. Just a reminder that this meeting is recorded and will be posted up to YouTube later, and that the Kubernetes community guidelines are in effect. So in general, please be excellent to one another. All right. If you have any topics that you would like to bring up, please go ahead and add them to the agenda. Let me see if I can go ahead and get that posted in the chat. All right. To start with, we do have a couple of announcements that both the version 0.5.0, RC.0, and RC.1 releases were previously cut since our last meeting. We've been using those for testing with the V1 Alpha 3 release for upstream cluster API and to better assist folks being able to test like the cluster kernel workflows and overall user experience. We do plan on cutting the version 0.5.0 release later this week. Hopefully tomorrow, but as soon as we can following the upstream cluster API release. I don't see any demos, which brings us into the group topics. So over to you, Joel, for the spot instance proposal.
Okay, so I wasn't sure whether we wanted to dive into this properly now or not. I'm happy to do a bit of an explanation about it, but we've got the spot instance proposal we've sort of put together over the last few weeks, which is basically to try and add spot instance support not only to the Azure, but also AWS and GCP providers. But the sort of way that we're planning to do that is by adding some fields into each of the cloud providers. Now, I spoke with Vince about this, and I've sort of summarized what he was saying there, which is that there might be concerns from each of the provider maintainers about adding fields, and that maybe it would be better to just try and go for adding support for machine pools. So I wanted to sort of see if there are any thoughts from your side on whether this is likely to be a non-starter or whether this is something that might be feasible to pursue. The proposal itself is quite lengthy. I did a lot of research on spot instances and stuff and put that in there so that people can read that if they want to. But yeah, if there's any questions about it, then ping me at any time. But I would like to get some feedback from some people on the Kappa side.
Yeah, so in general, I don't particularly see an issue with adding a field to support spot instances. In general, I do like the idea of officially supporting machine pools, but I think that's kind of potentially a tangential concern. I think there are particular use cases where you might want to retain kind of the machine semantics and still support spot instances versus having to take on all of kind of the machine pool semantics and the things that go along with that. So at least I think on the AWS side, we'd be open for changes that we need there. I can't necessarily speak for some of the other providers.
Yeah,
so.
Okay, that's good to know. Vince was suggesting that for GCP will be fine as well. I just need to then get an ACK from Azure. But yeah, the idea is it'd be an optional field on the machine spec that then could be used either by the machine pool implementation or the machine set implementation, machine implementation, that would make it a spot instance.
Yeah, so I can say one thing on the Azure side is that the big driver for them to moving towards machine pools was more a limitation on Azure and how many resources you can actually attach to a resource group. So that's kind of why they're driving the machine pool side, is because they were going to end up with potential issues just with a machine-based implementation and maxing out that max number of resources that can be attached to a resource group there.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, okay. In which case, yeah, if anyone could have some time at some point to have a read through and that maybe add some comments, like as I say, it's quite lengthy. But I would like to try and push this forward because we want to try and get it done in the next cycle, in the V04 cycle of CAPI. Yeah, would appreciate any feedback on it.
We're pretty interested in the idea of a spot instance backed machine pool, not to the exclusion of the field on the regular machine, but in addition to. So I'll take a look at that and see if I can't corral some other New Relic folks into helping out.
Thanks.
And I'll be happy to take a look at it once things slow down a little bit on the release side.
Thanks. Does anyone have any other questions about this one? Stuff that I can answer immediately, or?
But I will say thank you for tackling this. I know this is something that has come up quite a bit in the past. All right. Any other topics for today? All right, let's jump into the issues then. All right, let's see. All right, well, actually, let's start with the pull request, see if we have anything that doesn't have a milestone attached to it. This one's related to testing, so I'm not going to worry about tossing a milestone on there yet. This fix error links, it had some questions related to fixing things up, so need to wait for that to be addressed. And this one is also related to testing. I believe all the rest already have milestones attached. All right, on to issues. Tracking issue for etcd installer, or this is related to an upstream issue that we're seeing. I think we can easily put this in the 0.5.x milestone unless anybody disagrees.
We can absolutely do that, but I can throw out there that I did not see, like I saw the issue, I think, with CapD provider when I was testing the KCP stuff, but I created, I don't know, a dozen control plane rings with the AWS provider and didn't have an issue with it.
Yeah, so this is something that I've seen, at least when I've dug into the logs. I've never seen it actually causing any type of functional issues, at least with Kappa. So I think it's still probably worth digging into a little bit, but I don't think it's as critical as for some of the other providers that are seeing it more frequently right now. And this other one's around the periodic test failure. That's a known issue that's related to the testing one. So I'm just going to go ahead and bump this in the 0.5.x one for now. All right, that brings us into what we have left for 0.5.0, which, although it says past due by 3 days, is actually going to happen this week. We have the add instructions for existing AWS infrastructure. I think this one was just waiting on additional testing. I tried to do some testing on it last week, but was never able to finish it. Do we have anybody who thinks they might have some time to kind of validate these?
You can assign that to me, Jason.
All right. And just because I'm not familiar with everybody's voice right now.
Oh, sorry, that's Seth.
Okay, thanks, Seth. Unfortunately, when I'm sharing my screen, I only get like a limited camera view. All right. Actually, what am I doing? Sorry, my brain's not with me today. There we go. All right. The adding events for AWS cloud services failures. I believe there were some additional comments to be addressed here. Oh yeah, we wanted to get it rebased on master.
Jason, I would think you can take that out of the milestone until and unless it gets updated.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. All right, some AMIs missing the AWS CLI tools. I know Seth had found the point where we had added those and which AMIs didn't yet have them. So this is just a matter of me going ahead and doing this, and I'll do this as part of the release when we cut it. Let's see, add docs for consuming existing AWS infrastructure. That's related to the PR that we already discussed. Evaluate conversion webhook behavior based on Liggett's review of cluster API. I plan on doing this later today and into tomorrow.
So just for a CAPI update on that. So there were 4 different scenarios that Jordan recommended testing, and Sadaf tested all 4 of them for cluster API. And the only one that we found to be a potential issue, but at least in Vince's, in my opinion, not a blocking issue, is that if you submit an alpha 2 thingamajiggy and it has something that would cause it to fail alpha 3 open API validation. So the example that we tested, or that Sadaf tested, was you have a machine, and in the machine spec, there is a cluster name field in alpha 3 that doesn't exist in alpha 2. The expectation is that there would be a label in the alpha 2 machine that would get converted to the alpha 3 spec field, and then ideally go through open API validation to make sure that it's present. And because of the way that the API server does its order of operations, it appears that open API validation happens before converting to the storage version, which basically means that it passes alpha 2 validation because everything's fine. It gets converted to the alpha 3 version, goes against the validating webhook, which doesn't have a check for this field because it's an open API validation. And then because it's not doing additional open API validation, it just persists in etcd. So technically you have an object that, had you started with alpha 3, it wouldn't have failed open API validation, wouldn't be an etcd. The reason that Vince and I don't think it's a release blocker is that you can go in and edit the thing after you've created it and fill in the missing fields. And I think this is the sort of thing that'll probably be on a case-by-case basis, where if we find problems, we can fix them. Worst case, we could duplicate our validation so we have open API and webhook, but that's kind of icky. So mainly the fact that it doesn't break your informers and it doesn't break lists and that sort of thing. And we're going from an alpha version to another alpha version. We thought it was okay to defer any further investigation or resolution until a .x for upstream for CAPI.
Yeah, and just to add to that a bit, I also wanted to do just a little bit more overall scrutiny of the conversions that we have in place, just because it hasn't had the level of scrutiny that we've given to the upstream cluster API conversions at this point as well. Outside of that, we got validate failure domain support with respect to the V1 Alpha 3 cluster API failure domain handling. This is related to, I was going through and actually trying to do the validation of the existing infrastructure. And one of the things that I noticed is that we're not honoring the failure domain defined on the machine resource, only on only when it's set on the AWS machinery source. So right now, basically, even though we're exposing the failure domains through the AWS cluster status, and that's being consumed by cluster API and the control plane controller, when it's setting the failure domain on the machine, we're not actually respecting that at this point. So we need to kind of go through and do that. That said, I'm not necessarily sure that it's a blocker for the 0.5.0 release. Do you have thoughts there, Andy?
I'm sorry for the noise in the background. I'm just seeing this for the first time right now, so I think I probably need a little bit more time to digest it before I can give you any thoughts.
Yeah, it's definitely not a fun bug, but it is kind of in that space where it doesn't have any impact on the types that we're releasing. And that's kind of why I thought it might be bumpable, but it is definitely something we want to address pretty quickly after release.
So the implication is that, like, if the KCP controller picks a failure domain and sets it on the machine, it's not going to use it?
Yeah, it's basically ignored.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider it a release blocker. I mean, it's like a P 1.9.
Yeah.
So it's like really should get in the release, but we don't want to hold things up necessarily. So if it comes right after with like a, day 1 or day 2 type of patch, that's fine with me.
Yeah. So I'll leave it in the milestone for now, but I'll consider it potentially some that we can bump if needed if we don't get to it. Do we have anybody that could potentially take a look at this?
I wouldn't mind looking at it just because we haven't done failure domains at all in CatV. It's probably see how it should work, and then before we do it in CatV.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Nadir. Warning 11:56. Allow no key pair v1 alpha. Okay, this is the work from the Telos folks to try to get to allow to define no key pair to use on the machine by updating the current value of key pair that we have to a pointer and allowing specifically setting the empty string to say explicitly do not assign a key pair to this instance. I think there might have been, I think the last thing might just be getting things passing and the making sure that the conversions are working properly on this. Do you know where that ended up, Andy? I know you were talking with Andrew about this.
I was largely waiting for a response, but I see he's got
Okay.
some commits after I made that comment. So I have not looked at those, and I don't know what's up.
Yeah, I remember looking and seeing that there were specifically some issues with conversion-related things.
I can try and help him get it over the hump, but I don't know how critical it is to get this in now versus waiting until the next API version. But I
Yeah.
can look and see.
And I could reach out to them as well if you're busy. I just wanted to give them the opportunity to try to get this in before the release to prevent it being delayed even further.
Yeah, my top priorities right now are the etcd and kproxy and Accordion SPRs upstream, and then I can look at this.
All right. So outside of that, those are the only existing issues that we have for 0.5.0 release. Is there anything that anybody thinks we may be missing? Nope. All right. Any other topics, questions, comments, concerns?
I know Jay joined late. I didn't know, Jay, if there was anything you wanted to talk about with the testing, or you're just joining because you're interested. Either's fine.
Yeah, I'm working on some stuff, but you all know what it is mostly. So the concurrent Ginkgo tests. So nothing specific that I had to say about that, other than thanks for all the help, Jason and Nadir and everybody getting me up to speed.
Anytime. Anything else? All right. If not, we will see y'all in 2 weeks, and we will have a 0.5.0 release before then. So thank you all for all the work that you do, and thanks for attending.